I'm a professional tour guide and been conducting tours in the north of England for the past 25 years. Um, it would be around 2012 when I received a letter from an organisation called Visit England. And this is a tourism association. And as I got the letter, I opened it and I was told that I'd been awarded a tourism award with 12 other guides from Great Britain. And they were having a ceremony in the City of London at a place called Tower Bridge. Well, I got the train down from Preston and arrived at Euston, got the underground to Tower Bridge. I met these marvellous people who had been given the same award as myself, which was a Visit England award. One of them was a marvellous young lady called Jacqueline, and I got on very well with her. We had a glass of champagne and a chat before the photographers arrived to give us our awards, if you will. And she said that she was a Jack the Ripper tour guide. Now, I find the story quite fascinating, and I told her so. But of course, she was a professional tour guide, just concentrating on the Ripper story. She said, Simon, why don't you come on the tour tonight? And I thought, well, why not? I've got a return train ticket for tomorrow, so that's what I'll do. So she took me on a guided tour. And when we got to each area, she brought out photographs of the 1888 Whitechapel, which has changed beyond all recognition, mainly due to housing being replaced, but also the Luftwaffe in World War II did bomb London quite badly. And there's only one area left from the original part of Whitechapel, and that's a place called Mitre Square. So I went to the guided tour with her, and I found it fascinating. I'm still a very good friend of hers. And in 2014, she went to Ibiza for a holiday. And she said, Simon, would you like to do the Ripper tours for 10 days whilst I'm away? I thought, Jacqueline, I'd love to. She said, I know you can do it, but I'll come around with you again and just assess you. So she went to Ibiza, and for 10 gorgeous nights, I conducted Jack the Ripper tours in the City of London, which I really enjoyed. So let's now paint the picture. We're going to turn the clock back now to the 1880s. Whitechapel is a district of London. In 1888, it was really called Outcast London. It was densely populated, an area which was suitable for, shall we say, 50,000 people. Over 100,000 people lived crammed into housing. Out of those 100,000 people, a good 3,000 were permanently homeless, and they would live in what we call doss houses. The police absolutely hated Whitechapel because there was always trouble there, and it did have the reputation for being called Outcast London. To add to the problems, in 1888, the area had been filled with more people, over 15,000 Romanian, Polish, and Russian Jews. And these were extremely good businessmen. Arriving in Whitechapel, they immediately started their own businesses, but they would only employ their own people. So there's lots of friction, in fact, a lot of hatred between the original residents of Whitechapel and this new influx from the Jewish population that had come from their countries to escape persecution. Prostitution was rife on the streets of Whitechapel. The women that took part in the prostitution were ladies that didn't really want to do the job, but they had no option. And a lot of them were, of course, homeless, and the vast majority were indeed alcoholics. The only thing that could take away the horror of the work they were doing was a glass of gin. And a glass of gin, a good glass, would cost you 3 pence. 4 of those a day would keep you inebriated and take away the fear, but also some of those horrible people that they'd have to literally service. It wasn't a pleasant job. So a member of the Central News Agency, he made his way into Whitechapel one day, and he saw a lot of ladies at a workhouse, totally naked, standing in a queue. He noticed on their backs there was a lot of blood, and he thought, have these women been assaulted? No, said the work manager. It's bed bugs. They've scratched so hard on their skins that they've actually drawn blood. To get a bed for the night in the doss house would cost you 3 pence. You could actually go in the doss house and stand up all night, leaning over a rope for 1 pence. So things were quite hideously criminal, really, for those poor people that lived there all those years ago. And when you think only a few miles away, you've got the City of London and you've got the Bank of England. And in 1888, Great Britain was indeed a superpower, and yet you've got people living in real poverty crammed into this little place called Whitechapel. It's almost like a firework about to be lit, and that firework was lit towards the autumn of 1888. The person we know as Jack the Ripper, many people believe that he actually committed more offences before the 5 confirmed cases. And we shall now start with our first case, which was a young girl of the name of Emma Smith. Emma was terribly assaulted on the 4th of April, 1888, and she was assaulted in a disgraceful way. The person that attacked her actually inserted a knife into the poor girl's uterus and turned the knife. You can imagine the incredible pain she must have gone through. Bleeding quite badly, the poor girl made her way to Spitalfield Hospital, where she died 2 days later of septicemia. She couldn't describe the person that attacked her because it happened so quickly, and she was in such agonizing pain. Now, living in Whitechapel at that period of time was a lot of people that really did feel these women were actually causing not only problems, but indeed causing a lot of anti-Jewish feeling as well. So you could say that the atmosphere was getting very tense for this first murder. The second murder followed very quickly. That was Emma Tabrin, and Emma was murdered on the 7th of August at a place called Spitalfields Market. She had over 70 wounds in her body, and they believe that these wounds were actually caused by bayonet wounds. She had been seen drinking in a public house called the Britannia Inn with 2 soldiers. The 2 soldiers were arrested, but they were found that on the night they were actually in Whitechapel, they didn't have any weapons with them. They were just wearing their number 2 uniforms. They hadn't any weapons with them, so they were released. Word got around Whitechapel that the police weren't really interested, and no one seemed to care about these women that had lost their lives. And a vigilante squad was set up. And this vigilante squad felt the police were doing absolutely nothing, and they were going to take the law into their own hands. The leader of this vigilante squad was a gentleman called George Lusk, and George was a builder. He was in some ways the unofficial mayor of Whitechapel. He felt the police weren't interested, so let's mete out our own justice. And they started patrolling the streets of Whitechapel, but to no avail. But we now start with our first registered murder. And that took place on the 31st of August at a place called Bucks Row, which is again not too far from Spitalfields Market. It was a lady named Polly Nichols. Now, Polly's life had been quite sad, really. She had 5 children. One of them had been quite badly deformed on birth. The 3rd child had actually run away, and her other 2 children had died before they reached maturity. To add to her woes, she had another child, but of all the incredible things to happen, her husband fell in love with a midwife, and she was thrown out. She did live with her father for a while, but she turned to alcohol, and her father had to throw her out because her drinking just got out of hand, and she found herself walking the streets of Whitechapel. That night, the last person to see her alive was a lady called Emily Holland. Emily was also a fellow prostitute, and she was making her way back to her doss house when she saw Polly outside. And she said, "Are you right, Polly?" No, not really. I ain't got no money. I've been checked out, but I'll soon get some money. I've got a lovely new bonnet to wear, and I'll get some money. I'll get me kip organised. As she made her way down Bucks Row, someone came out of the shadows at great speed. This person cut her throat from left to right. As she slipped to the floor, he terribly mutilated her and then disappeared into the shadows. We presume about half an hour later, a gentleman called Robert Cross, who worked at Spitalfields Market, was walking to work and came across this body with a large pool of blood next to it. He shouted and shouted, and PC Neal arrived of the Metropolitan Police and thought, oh yes, another lady of the night. Dr. Llewellyn was called, and Dr. Llewellyn was the police surgeon, and he just literally wrote out the death certificate without really examining the body. The body was then taken to the local workhouse and stripped by inmates, and they were horrified as they took her clothes off to find she'd been very, very badly mutilated around the abdomen. Again, word got round Whitechapel, another murder taking place. And this really infuriated George Lusk and his vigilantes because the police weren't even interested. Now, H Division of the Metropolitan Police were in charge of that area, and Inspector Aberline and Sergeant Teague were told to try and solve these terrible, terrible murders. But they had to, first of all, find witnesses, and they had to, first of all, capture this person that was almost like a special air service trooper, making no sound. The murder Pollyann took place in Bucks Row, literally yards from over 300 people sleeping. Not a single sound was heard. It's believed that he got a hand over her mouth and cut her throat from behind, so she couldn't even make a noise of any kind whatsoever. It is believed that he was wearing rubber-soled shoes, which for that period of time were quite unique, really, because not a single sound, no hobnail boot, no toe and heel cap was heard. He just disappeared into the night. Our next murder took place on the 7th of September that year, and was the murder of Anne Chapman. Now, Anne, God bless her, she had quite a sad life. Her life has started quite nicely, really. Her husband had been a coachman at Windsor Castle, and they had quite a nice wage coming in. Sadly, alcohol ruled her life, and she left her home, made her way into London, and for a while she stayed with a sieve maker and was known locally as Civvy. She also was extremely good at needlework, and for a while she sold flowers, but her lust for alcohol won the day. She was seen outside number 29 Hanbury Street by our first witness, and that was a lady called Elizabeth Long. Elizabeth was brought in after the murder, but let's go for the murder first of all. As she walked past number 29 Hanbury Street, she saw a person wearing a deerstalker hat, slightly brownish hair, and she thought he spoke with a foreign accent, certainly not English, and she remembered the words, "Will you?" "Yes, I will." They made their way to the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street, a backyard, literally. Around 3:30 in the morning, a chap called John Kadesh, who was a Polish Jewish gentleman, he made his way into the yard next door, and there was literally a fence on either side. He was there to relieve himself, to urinate, and he thought he heard a dull thud against the side of the fence, but thought nothing of it. He knew that the area was used by prostitutes and thought nothing of it. The following morning, another person living in that same house opened the door of number 29 Hanbury Street, looked down, and saw a body lying right outside the back door. Her internal organs had been lifted from her and put on her shoulder, and he was violently sick. PC Tanner was brought in, and he contacted Chief Inspector Arnold of H Division Metropolitan Police. He arrived, and he was quite shocked and horrified as he looked down at this woman lying flat on her back, legs apart, intestines on her left shoulder. At her feet were 3 pills. Now, Anne had been suffering from a lung disorder, and she'd also been involved in a fight 2 days previously over a bar of soap with another prostitute in the Britannia public house, some yards from Hanbury Street. The letter had an Essex stamp on it, and also an Essex Infantry Regiment insignia, which must have been a relative. There was a handkerchief on the floor as well, but nearby was a porcelain dish, and in that porcelain dish was a leather apron. Now, the Metropolitan Police were looking for a gentleman called John Pfizer. John Pfizer was indeed a Romanian Jew, and he'd actually organised his own ring of prostitutes. You could say he was a pimp in many, many ways. He was immediately arrested, but not before the people who owned number 29 Hamber Street were letting people go upstairs to look into the yard, but charging them a penny at a time. It seems that this murder really did attract the attention of the local public, and it was a good 12 hours before Anne's body was actually moved from the back of 29 Hamber Street. Mr. George Lusk was extremely annoyed because the police were very late getting there, and he told the local central news agency that the police are useless. They don't care about us. They don't care about law and order, etc. That's when a letter was sent to the central news agency, and I shall read the letter to you, folks. It's known simply as the Dear Boss letter. The boss, of course, was indeed the editor of the central news agency. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me yet. I've laughed when they look so bleeding clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I'm actually down on horse, and I shan't quit ripping them till I get buckled myself. Grand work, the last job. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love me work and want to start again. You'll soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue, and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, though. Ha ha! The next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send them to the police officers just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away. If I get a chance, good luck. Well, that letter found itself on the front page of every newspaper in Great Britain. Even the New York Times had it on their front page as well. It seems that this murder and this person had certainly caught the imagination of the whole world. The criticism towards the police was incredible. Now, the head of the police was a gentleman called Sir Charles Warren. He was the commissioner. And Charles Warren, the year before, had been a British Army officer, a high-ranking major, actually. And he'd been brought in specially to really tighten things up. But he was getting a lot of criticism because his men hadn't caught this person. And these murders had caught the attention of nearly everyone. Under him, he had Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was waiting to retire. He wasn't really bothered. And beneath him, Donald Swanson. He was the chief inspector of the Metropolitan Police. And immediately below him, we have Frederick Aberline. He was the lead detective. And Aberline was getting an awful lot of criticism, not only from the national press, but indeed the people of Whitechapel. He was determined, along with Sergeant Teague, to capture this person. It wasn't long for that to wait until what we call the night of the double murder. And this took place on the 3rd of September, 1888. We now have our third witness, a gentleman called Israel Schwarzer. As you gathered, he was a Russian Jew, and he'd been walking along what we call Devonshire Street, not too far from a place called Dutfield's Yard. And he had seen our next shall we say, victim, who was called Elizabeth Long. Elizabeth was actually Danish, and she was the only one of our victims to be a professional prostitute. She'd been born in Gothenburg, and she had indeed been a prostitute in her native country and been treated for venereal diseases. She came over to England, and she went down to a place called Dungeness in Kent, the county of Kent, where she met a chap called Jack Stride, and Jack Stride was indeed a local shipwright. He was a shipbuilder. He was a lot older than her, and as he became quite old, she thought, I need a bit more of a better life, and she made her way to London. She walked the streets of Whitechapel. She was actually rescued by, of all people, the Swedish church, and they offered to give her work, etc. But she found the church a bit boring, and she went back to her original job, which was walking the streets. So she was arguing. She was heard to be shouting, arguing quite loudly with this man, who again had a deerstalker hat on and was shaking his fist at her and getting quite agitated. Israel Schwartz went across the other side of the road so he could get past them. because he, as he later said, it looked to be quite an unpleasant situation. At 11 o'clock that night, a chap called Louis Dumschels. Louis was he was actually a Romanian Jew. He'd been living in Whitechapel for 5 years, and he got his own business up and running. He had his own horse and trap, which would be the BMW for that period of time. And he was making his way back to Dutfield's Yard, where he lived. He'd also opened his own private club for the Jewish people living in that area. And his wife ran it. But he was also, he would trade in jewels as well. He was a diamond jeweler, a very clever man and a very wealthy man as well. As his horse entered the courtyard of Dutfield's Yard, the horse shied, as if something had startled it. And Louis had to really pull the reins back to stop the horse from bolting. In the dim light, he climbed off the trap, and there he saw what looked like a body on the floor. He thought, is that my wife? Has she been drinking too much? He walked towards the body and lit a match and was staring into the eyes of Elizabeth Stride. She'd had a throat cut, but that was it, just that. Her body was still intact. Whoever it was had been startled, and many people believe that Louis Dumschels and his horse actually stopped the Ripper from conducting his disemboweling of this poor woman. The local press actually called her Lucky Lizzie. Although she'd been murdered, she hadn't been disemboweled, and she got the name of Lucky Lizzie. However, our murderer is quite annoyed because he's been stopped from carrying on his duties, so he's now going to make his way straight out of Whitechapel and for the very, very first time enter the city of London, which is right in the very, very centre of this metropolis and had its own police force, which comes under Major Henry Smith. He's also ex-army. He has just 200 constables, and they look after the very, very centre of the city of London. That night, or should I say afternoon, poor Catherine Eddowes. Now, Catherine came from Wolverhampton. Her life had started quite well, but I'm afraid alcohol, like our other victims, took her life over. In the summer months, she made her way down to the beautiful hop fields of Kent, where she would pick hops all summer and breathe the warm air in and the warm sunshine. But in the winter months, of course, she'd have to revert back to her profession, which was indeed prostitution. Now, Catherine absolutely loved a drink, and they say she could knock back a good five glasses of gin from 10 o'clock in the morning till at least 10 o'clock in the evening. She was found to be so drunk that she was actually picked up by a police officer, and two police officers were actually taken to Spitalfields police station. There she was thrown into a cell. Now the duty sergeant was perhaps, if he'd just given her some more time, this woman may not have lost her life. But in the very, very early hours of the morning, she was actually thrown out of the police station, and still quite drunk, she had to hang onto the wall to actually make her way down. She made her way across Mitre Square. Now, Mitre Square is actually just that. It's a very, very large open square. It's densely populated, buildings right round it. And there was over 4,000 people sleeping in buildings right round the square. There was also a warehouse and people were working. It was quite busy as Catherine made her way into Mitre Square. Patrolling that night was Police Constable Watkins of the City of London Police and Police Constable Kenyon. It would take them 7 minutes to walk right round the entire square, and they'd walk together. In that period of time, our murderer came from the shadows, grabbed Catherine by her throat, cut her left to right, and as she slowly went to the ground, he disemboweled her, but he also removed, with precision, her right kidney. The kidney was removed as if it had been taken by a professional. Her uterus was very, very badly cut up, and her intestines were lifted onto her right shoulder, very, very similar to the Annie Chapman murder, actually. And then he just disappeared. Now, it took 7 minutes for these 2 police officers to get round Mitre Square. And as PC Kenyon came round, he looked down and saw this horrible sight of this poor woman who'd been murdered right behind their backs. And they'd heard nothing, absolutely nothing. Whistles were blown, lights came on, people filed onto Mitre Square to see this horrible, horrible, grisly sight. And the police then said, right, we know our murderer is going to make his way from London, central London, back into Whitechapel. We need to throw a ring of defence right round the whole area. And that's what they did do. Even George Lusk and his vigilantes filled every single alleyway leading back into Whitechapel. Somehow, our murderer got back undetected. Totally undetected. He must have been almost like, as I say before, like a special air service trooper. Fast, highly efficient, and highly, highly dangerous. Now, this is where the story does take a very, very sinister twist. PC Kenyon noticed there was a horse trough in Mitre Square that was still swirling with blood from freshly washed hands, and he gave chase across Mitre Square. And just outside the City of London jurisdiction, literally yards, he saw a wall with the words, "The Jewies," spelt Jewess, "will not be blamed for everything." Beneath it was a piece of Catherine Eddowes' petticoat. It had been wiped clean with the blood of the knife that had just claimed the poor girl's life. It was the same fabric from her petticoat. When the body was taken into the mortuary to be examined, the police surgeons were absolutely horrified that any human being could conduct this terrible ritual. She'd also had some flesh removed from both under her eyelids and her nose cut off as well. It was a terrible, terrible sight. And in many ways, had the police kept her in the cell, she would not have lost her life that night. So Abilene arrives, and Major Smith says, no, this is City of London jurisdiction now. But there is some graffiti over there, and he was shown the graffiti. Now, when Sir Charles Warren arrived, he said, "Get that off! Wipe the graffiti off. If the Jewish people see that tomorrow morning when it's light, we'll have riots on our hands. Get it off." And Major Henry Smith of the City of London Police said, "Look, what's the problem? We just need to take a photograph. Then you can..." No, get it off now. PC Kenyon took his notebook out and he wrote the words down, and that's why we still have this important piece of evidence. Whether it was written by our murderer, we'll never know. What we do know is Sir Charles Warren wanted to get rid of that straight away. It was almost as if he was infatuated with the graffiti, but it was indeed erased. Major Smith and his officers, of course, all they could do was contact the police station where she was thrown out of, and they had their own inquiry, but they too were absolutely stunned by the lack of evidence. They did ask for any witnesses, and that very night we again have 3 witnesses. One gentleman called John Levander, William Levi, and John Harris. They'd been drinking in a pub on the corner of Mitre Square, and as it happened, John Levander could see this person, again deerstalker, slight gingerish hair, talking to Catherine in the corner of Mitre Square. And his words were, "Right, lads, it's getting a bit dodgy round here. Let's get across the other side of the square. It's getting too dangerous round here." And that's what they did do, but not before Levander noticed that the person he'd seen had a package wrapped in newspaper, quite a long package, which could have actually held a knife. We shall never, ever know. So we have our 4th confirmed victim, Catherine Eddowes. That's when another letter is sent, but this time to, of all people, Mr. Lusk, the vigilante, the organizer of the vigilante. It's called the Letter from Hell. "Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from the woman I killed. I preserved it. I took the animal as well. I preserved it for you to actually have a look at. I fried and ate the other one. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out while you wait a while longer. Signed, Jack the Ripper. Catch me if you can, Mr. Lusk." So the whole of the country is absolutely horrified when another letter arrives, again to the Central News Agency. I was not kidding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I get to work again. Jack the Ripper. Well, by now, the whole world is infatuated in this story. George Lusk gets a lot of his vigilantes to wear women's clothes. The Metropolitan Police, they up all their patrols, but they still can't seem to catch this person. We have to wait some time now, and many people think, oh, well, that's it. Whoever it was has disappeared. But on the 9th of November, we're going to have our last confirmed case, and that was a young lady called Mary Kelly. Now, Mary was totally different to our other 4 victims in the fact that she was just 25 years old, and she was indeed a very, very attractive young girl. She came from Ireland, and she had indeed married, she'd left her native Ireland, gone to South Wales, and there she met a fabulous young man with the name of John Kelly, and he was a miner. He was killed in an underground explosion, and it upset her terribly. She uproots and made her way to London. She did try working in factories, but to no avail. And she decided to go into that trade of prostitution because, like the other 4 victims, she too enjoyed a glass of gin. Now we have our best witness coming up, a chap called George Hutchinson. And many people wish that George had hung around just a little bit later. Mary was the only victim that actually had her own premises. When I say her own premises, she had a bedsit. She was behind with her rent. A chap called Mr. John Boyer owned the building. And he got quite annoyed, but she said, don't worry, love. I'll have your money next week. Next week never really came. She was seen on that night, that November night, with a gentleman that didn't match the other description from Elizabeth Long and Lavanda. But this person was actually, as he put it, a toff. He looked like he'd just come from one of the local theatres. He had a top hat. He had a wax moustache. He had a white scarf on. He had white gloves, spats, and highly polished shoes. And he was seen actually arm in arm with Mary Kelly outside her bedsit. Now, Hutchinson wanted her services. He couldn't actually afford it. But as a favour, she had actually, dare I say, serviced him a few times for free. And he thought, if I hang around, this bloke will go and I'll be all right. He was quite interested in this person because he was a toff and he wanted to have a look at his face. So therefore, he knelt down in the shadows to tie his shoelace to try and look up. And he did look up and saw quite a young person, really. Wax moustache. When I say young, say 35, 40 tops around there, really. He literally waited outside the bedsit, looking at his timepiece, and he thought, oh, no, it's nearly 12 midnight. I'll go home. If he had stayed, he would have seen Jack the Ripper face to face. Inside Miller's Court, where Mary lived, a terrible, terrible act is taking place. She's had her throat cut in typical Ripper fashion, but he's also skinned her. He's removed her skin from her face, from her abdomen, her legs, and thrown the organs around the room. He's also got her clothes and put them in the fireplace to illuminate the room so he could continue with this orgy, this terrible, terrible orgy. He then disappears out into the night. The following morning, Mr. Boyer, the rent collector, came to get his rent. There was a broken window and he pulled the curtain back and he looked inside. I was horrified what he'd seen. Now, Scotland Yard do indeed have a photograph of this terrible, terrible murder. And here we are in the 21st century. It is not a pleasant photograph to look at. In fact, it's very, very unpleasant. Inspector Aberline arrived along with Sergeant Teague, and Sergeant Teague was actually reduced to tears. He couldn't believe how any human being could commit such a terrible, terrible, evil crime. And then there was silence. However, Hutchinson was interviewed by the police, and they were quite shocked that he had given a completely different description to Lavender, Israel Schwartz, and Elizabeth Long, because they'd mentioned a person with a deerstalker cap, almost like a reefer jacket, and sandy-coloured hair, and also with a foreign accent. But this person was totally, totally different. For the very, very first time, Scotland Yard were brought in, a gentleman called Charles McNaughton. He was quite shocked because Sir Charles Warren had indeed resigned because he got so much criticism from not catching this man. It had actually cost him his job. And Scotland Yard took over. They, of course, were interested in our witnesses, particularly to Hutchinson, who had actually tied the shoelace and looked up and actually seen the actual murderer's face. Now, Sir Charles McNaughton and Warren, they had their ideas, but they were always arguing, really. And McNaughton thought, no, Scotland Yard will take over completely now. And they looked at the suspects, and this is where the story gets really, really interesting. Whoever committed these crimes was very, very fast. He was extremely fast. He knew Whitechapel like the back of his hand, and he used the darkness. They believe that he did wear a rubber sole because no footsteps were ever heard. Rubber soles in that period of time are quite unique, really, quite rare, really. But let's look at the actual suspects. Coming in at number one, Sir William Gull. Now, he was the Queen's surgeon, Queen Victoria's surgeon. And this theory is as follows. Prince Leopold Victor was Queen Victoria's grandson. Now, he did make ventures into Whitechapel, and it has been said that he did, in fact, shall I say, have contact with one or two of these young ladies of the night. However, we do know that on the case of Martha Tabron and indeed Catherine Eddowes, he was actually at Balmoral. So therefore, he certainly couldn't be brought to justice for those two murders, that's for sure. But the other theory is that he fathered an illegitimate child. And this child was looked after by Anne Nichols, Anne Chapman, Lizzie Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. They all knew about it. At least this is the theory. And they believe that Sir William Gull was horrified if this story got out into the local press, that he organised the murder of all 5 women. The fact that we never heard any footsteps is quite intriguing, really. And one theory is that Sir William Gull had, of course, a coach, would entice these women into the coach with a drink, murder them in the coach, and then drop their bodies off at different parts of Whitechapel. It is just a theory, but it was taken very, very seriously by McNaughton. Scotland Yard's number one suspect was a chap called John Montague Druitt. Druitt was a young man. He was a failed student, medical student. His father was a highly successful doctor. He had a surgery not too far from Whitechapel, and certainly Druitt would know the area. One thing Druitt did have, though, was a real hatred for women, a real hatred. Through no fault of his own, he was, to use a modern term, gay, and preferred male company to female company, and looked at these prostitutes with a real hatred. He'd also had knowledge of how to use what they believe was a mortuary knife, and some items, some organs were removed very, very professionally, and that's why he was a suspect. He would know the area very, very well, and on the night of that murder, the Miller's Court murder of Mary Kelly, he just disappeared. And Scotland Yard, who were now on the case, thought he'd left London, but his body, literally 4 weeks later, was found in the River Thames. And it seems that he took his own life. He'd been a very, very unhappy person, drinking very heavily. He'd failed as a medical student. He got a job as a teacher, but was sacked from his job as a teacher because he was inappropriate behaviour towards one or two of the pupils. So a very, very tortured spirit. But Scotland Yard were convinced that was him when they found his body washed up on the River Thames 4 weeks later. Another suspect was called Dr. Donson. Now, he specialised in black magic. He was well known within London circles for using human flesh for some of his demonic, shall we say, experiments. But he was an old man, really. He could hardly walk, really, so he wouldn't be fast. He might know the area. So therefore, although he was taken very, very seriously by Scotland Yard, I personally don't think that he would have been capable. And this is where we bring in our American suspect. He was a gentleman called Dr. Tumblety. Tumblety, I believe, came from Wisconsin. And when he had dinner parties, he had jars full of formaldehyde from alcohol, etc. And there were various female organs inside these jars. He would point them out, etc. We do know he was in London at the time of these murders. We do know he was actually there. He had gone to St. Thomas's Hospital, and I know this must sound crazy, but he'd actually asked if he could purchase some uteruses, actually purchase them for medical experiments, as he put it, really. A very, very strange request, but it was taken very seriously because he was in London at the time, and because organs had removed from some of our victims, he was indeed a suspect. We do know that Scotland Yard was on his tail. He made his way from London to Paris, and from Paris he made his way back to the United States of America. A lot of people believe that he could have been involved, and he was certainly taken very, very seriously by the American authorities as well, to such a degree where his body was actually exhumed many, many, many years later, and 2 rings were found in there. What I did forget to mention is that when Annie Chapman was murdered, her rings were removed. There was 3 florins by her feet, but her rings have been removed. And whether those rings belonged to Annie Chapman, we'll never, ever know. But Dr. Tumblety was a suspect. And the fact that he scarpered, he got out the area very, very quick to get back to his native America, again, seems to strengthen this. But we do know, like Dr. Donson, he was quite an elderly man. And there's no way he would have known Whitechapel as well as this character. And again, he would have to move very, very quickly. I don't think he was our suspect. Another suspect is Robert Cross. Now, Robert Cross worked at the Spitalfields markets. He was the first person to actually see the body of Polly Ann Nichols, the first person. For all we know, he could have murdered her. What we do know is he knew Whitechapel very well. He worked in the cattle market as a slaughterman, and he would have removed organs from pigs and from cows, and blood and gore would be nothing to him whatsoever. This is just a suspect. But our most famous suspect would be a Polish Romanian of the name of Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski, of course, had a foreign accent. He was about the same height that Elizabeth Long saw. Elizabeth only saw this person from behind wearing the deerstalker hat and having a reefer jacket, but he had the same colour hair. He would have known Whitechapel very, very well, and also been very good with a knife. And he was very athletic. I do know many years ago, Scotland Yard and the FBI got together and they looked at all the suspects. And the FBI people were convinced that Kosminski was indeed our murderer. We'll never know. But what I can tell you is many, many years later, in the city of Liverpool, way back in 1977, a house in Toxteth was bought. It was the home of a chap called Mr. James Maybrick, and James Maybrick was a very, very wealthy Lancashire textile baron. He liked going to Whitechapel. He did, in fact, frequent it quite often for young ladies, if you will, for women that walk the streets. He was in London every single night a murder took place. Now, in 1977, a diary was found in his attic by the people who just bought the house, and they sifted through all the debris in the attic and they found this diary. and it hit the headlines. We found Jack the Ripper's diary, and people from all over the world were absolutely fascinated. However, they found that the paper in the diary had all been made in 1955, so therefore Maybrick is not really a suspect. We do know that he drank very, very heavily. Coming from Liverpool, he wouldn't have known the area as well as perhaps Aaron Kosminski. Now, my good friend Jacqueline, who conducts the tours there's many, many guides that do this tour in London. She had a theory when I had a chat to her. Every time there was a murder, the murders took place, in the City of London harbour was a German ship called the Seraph, a German ship called the Seraph. And of course, the sailors would go ashore each night. And the Seraph, she was a frequent visitor to London. And every time a murder took place, she was actually in the City of London dock. We do know that that vessel would, of course, make its way across the Atlantic Ocean to America and South America. And in Nicaragua, just only a few months later, there were 3 young ladies of the night there that had been very, very badly mutilated in exactly the same fashion. Now, of course, Scotland Yard, they tried to get the access to the Seraph's logbook, but sadly, there was no details at all of the crews because they'd all been lost in the archives in Germany in World War II due to the bombing of Frankfurt. So therefore, the evidence has never, ever been brought to light. But it is a story which has absolutely fascinated the public. And what makes it so fascinating is that none of us will ever really find out who Jack the Ripper is. In the turn of this century, of course, DNA was discovered. And those letters sent to the Central News Agency were looked at from the museum at Scotland Yard, and they carefully peeled the stamp off. And they got DNA from the stamp. But they found that the DNA came from the postmistress at Spitalfields post office. Yes, she'd have got the letter. She'd have licked the stamp and she'd have put that stamp on the letter. But of course, she died many, 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 many years ago. So she couldn't be interviewed. But it is an intriguing, intriguing story. And there we have the Jack the Ripper story. Thank you, folks.
Absolutely. Simon, how are we getting an echo?
No idea.
See, we've got an echo for somewhere. Is it still there?
Yeah, no problem.
Absolutely brilliant, Simon. Every time you tell a story, you get this incredible knack of pulling us into the story, and you just kind of, we just kind of sit there and listen. Every single time you do it. It is, Jack the Ripper is probably one of the most famous serial killers of all time. And as you say, who he was is never ever going to be found out, whether it's DNA or, whatever. I know there's many different theories, many different suspects. I've got my own theories, my own thoughts on it. There's just some comments I'd like to go over with you as well. Jennifer, have you got any questions from the UK side, the USA side there?
Oh, no. It's just reminding me of different movies and how many different movies they've made about Jack the Ripper and how many are based on theories. Out of all of those that were made, which one do you think is the most accurate to those stories?
Well, there's a marvellous book by Dr. Rumbleton, and he's an ex-Scotland Yard detective. There are some fabulous films out there. It just gets the imagination, doesn't it, really? But in all fairness, Jennifer, I just think the facts are the most important things, aren't they, really? I actually feel deeply sorry for these poor women, not because they lost their lives in such a terrible, evil way, but they were brave women, really, and they had no option, absolutely no option, but to go to prostitution. And when you think that these, even nowadays, cities across the world, it's taking place right now, and these women, they take their lives in their hands every single time. And you imagine having to service someone who's probably not had a bath for 5 years, or not a pleasant sight. It can't be pleasant, really. It really can't be pleasant. And they have nothing but my respect, really, these women. They really, really do. Yeah. And they've gone down in history, of course. They weren't born to do that, but they have. Yeah.
Before we carry on, Simon, I totally forgot to say when you first came in about your nomination for the RVBA award, the Business Award, Simon. Congratulations on your nomination, and keep your fingers crossed for you, buddy. I totally forgot.
It is up to the judges, actually, Scott. It's up to the judges, but it is nice to be nominated. And I say I really do love my job, and I've been doing this for like 25 years now. And I used to work for a local authority, local council, and they had sick pay, they had holiday pay, and to actually leave a job like that, it was a leap of faith, but it's something I've never regretted. The first year, it was pretty tough, because I wasn't earning anything like I did then, but it's good to do something you really enjoy. And I think tour guiding is a fantastic job. And you can go to any city in Great Britain and America, of course, and you meet these really enthusiastic people. It's great fun. Yeah, great fun.
It's usually, you can tell, just as I said, when you finished with Jack the Ripper, you can tell how passionate you are about what you do and about history, just with the way you tell the story. Mm-hmm. I've listened to a few historians in my time, and no disrespect to them, but you kind of get bored after the first kind of 5 minutes, because it's a dull, flat tone all the way through. But you had the kind of excitement of the voices and the accent, and it's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
Well, keep our fingers crossed for the award, buddy. To get back to Jack the Ripper, it is a fascinating story. I think the police, as you said near the start, the police weren't too quick to respond simply because of where it was, and if it had been some kind of rich doctor or something, then they would be on it. But because of it was prostitutes basically, that's why they didn't respond the way they did. One of my theories is it's always been it was an immigrant basically. I think it was somebody who came over.
I think it was definitely foreign. Yeah, I think so. I really do. Yeah.
Robbie Crossing's got a few comments. I'm going to put them up for you to see what you think of them. He's talking about the Royal Doctor.
Oh yes.
Bear with me 2 seconds. We'll get them up for you, buddy. Just get your insight on.
It's yeah. I mean, I won't dispute that. I really won't dispute that. I do know that Charles McNaughton, he did in fact try and interview Aaron Kuzminski. He took him down to Brighton to a place called the Seaside Rest Home, which was actually owned by the Metropolitan Police. But he brought in the witnesses, and of course, Lavander and Harrison Levi were Jewish, and apparently their religion forbids them to condemn another Jew. So therefore, they couldn't help the police with their inquiries, really. But I do like Robbie's. Robbie could be quite right. Yeah.
We painted women and one wearing jewellery in the same pattern to the wounds of the victim. I've said in previous lives that I think he maybe had, obviously his victims were all women, all prostitutes. That he did have also a hatred of women.
Yeah.
And I think this could have stemmed back to his early days, his younger years. Maybe his mother or whoever, and through abuse or something like that, and this is where it all started back. And we got a good question for you. Many hours you spend researching your stories. It'll take me hundreds to know half as much as you know.
Well, I say Jacqueline, she was the tour guide that I met in London, and I just soak things in really. But the best way is to actually go on the tour, and you start to take things in. And if you're not sure on certain things, you just do it again. But I found when I conduct a brand new tour, the first one's the toughest, but the second, once you've done it once, it's there forever really. And what I actually did do in my hometown, Scott, because all of Whitechapel's really gone now. It's all modern housing, thank God. All those horrible warehouses have gone. All that poverty has gone. But there's certain areas in my hometown that have Victorian streets and Victorian ginnels and snickleways. And I actually do conduct a Jack the Ripper tour in my hometown, but using the Victorian area. And you have to, of course, use your imagination. But because the original Whitechapel's all gone, you could probably do it anywhere in the city of Glasgow, which will have some gorgeous Victorian areas.
Oh, I'm from Glasgow originally.
Yeah.
And it's got some pretty nice Victorian area, you know, to God, different kind of.
Oh yes, yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of it's still standing. To this day, even like Edinburgh as well. We like, you know, I love Edinburgh.
Yes, yeah.
In Edinburgh, you know, the Royal Mile, Greyfriars, that area. But one theory I've got, just when you were saying about when he actually ventured into London and then he get back into Whitechapel, you know, obviously they locked off Whitechapel as best they could.
Yes.
One theory I've got is he actually went over them to get in, over the rooftops. I know it might sound absurd.
No. I mean, quite possibly. Remember that this lad was almost, like I said before, like a special air service trooper. He was almost like a commando, if you will, a ruthless killer, but a very, very fit, athletic person. And you're probably quite right. He probably did go over the rooftops to get back in again. He would know how to do it, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's... Robbie saying Glasgow was pulled down, not much of our old town. Well, I've been in Glasgow for a while, Robbie. So I left Glasgow about 6 years ago. So
yes.
I know up the east end of Glasgow there's a lot of Victorian houses and what have you.
Oh, yes.
Kelvin Side, Kelvin Hall, and all the, you know, all that, round about that area. I know a lot of it has been hauled down, but up that end there's still a lot of old buildings, especially the art galleries as well. That's a beautiful building in Glasgow. So it's such a shame because nowadays we definitely have been able to solve this with forensics and, of course, all the equipment we now have, dash cams, mobiles and surveillance. That's true.
Very, very much so. In fact, it would be marvellous, wouldn't it, Scott, to have a time capsule. And I suppose, I know this might sound a bit strange, but I'd love to go back to that period of time and leave a hidden camera on the Essex Wharf building and on Bucks Row, facing the exact area. And then to get that information would be just something else, wouldn't it, really? It would be.
I've been to London quite a few times. So say I've been to I've been all over the city centre and what have you. Hi Wayne, thanks for coming in, buddy. And it's a fascinating city. You know, the Tower Bridge, Tower of London.
Yeah.
Everywhere, London. I've walked in London quite a few times and spent hours just wandering, you know, looking at the whole area. The thing that got me with the Jack the Ripper murders is why they just suddenly stopped. I know a lot of evidence was destroyed because obviously it wasn't needed anymore. It's why they just suddenly came to a halt, because obviously there was 5 victims that we know of. Personally, I think there was a lot more.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I think the murder of Emma Smith and Tabron, it was just the start, I think. Just the start. I mean, the first assault was pretty horrible, terrible, really. Second was a frenzied attack. And the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh were indeed disemboweling. It was getting, really frenzied with this terrible act. Terrible, really. Must have been a deranged person, but a very, very deadly one as well.
Well, that's the thing, you know, because he put so much effort into it. So he obviously got some kind of gratification, whether it was sexual or whatever, gratification out of it. And for him just to suddenly stop. So, I mean, my belief is that he was killed somehow. You know, whether it was murdered or accidentally. Accidental. I don't see somebody, and this is just my opinion, I don't see somebody who puts that much time and effort and enjoys doing that so much just suddenly stopping.
That's true, isn't it? Yeah.
there's another theory that is he set himself a target. I want to kill 5 women, and once he'd done that, he'd reached his target. But I think that's a wee bit.
But was there not similar murders took place in other parts of the world not long after it? So it could be possible that he could have buggered off Whitechapel and went to wherever America.
Yeah, South America. Yeah. The Seraph, when she was in the harbour there, that's when it happened again. And this is just another theory, of course. It's just another theory that it could have been a German, but that person must have been very, very quick, very fast, and must have known Whitechapel very well.
I know it's off topic, but Robbie crosses St. Jamie. Any idea who you think Bible John is? I think it's Peter Tobin. I think it was proved it was Peter Tobin, Robbie. I think, when he was caught, they managed to prove that he was actually Bible John. But so back to Jack the Ripper. It's a fascinating story. There's that much to it. And there's theories that he was actually a policeman.
There's Andy Murphy made a good comment.
All this seems to me was a series of planned acts carried out with a guarantee of secrecy. Maybe it stopped because Clancy felt was on the verge of getting caught and dealt with.
It's a good theory, Andy. It is. It is a good theory. Yeah. It is a good theory. But say Kosminski was found later on that year. He was actually eating food from the gutter, mental problems, and he went into an asylum. And we know he died around 1929. Actually, Drew was found dead in the River Thames. But I think those two were definitely quite strong suspects, really. But we'll never know, really.
No. And then there's the other. I mean, there's hundreds of theories. The other theory is that he picked prostitutes because back then, they wouldn't really have been noticed.
No.
Because there was many of them, and as you say, the area was that densely populated. He probably thought, I can do what I want. I'll not be noticed, but people did pick up their ears and notice, what was going on. What about you, Jennifer? What's your theory on Jack the Ripper?
I think that he's like our Zodiac killer. He left. After he did, he got his fancy. He got his jollies. He may have done it somewhere else, but I think he left. I think he lived to an old age, died somewhere, and there's no way we're gonna ever know. He wouldn't be the only serial killer out there that's ever done that, who's gone cold and then something else similarly pops up but we have nothing to go by. So it's very possible that Jack the Ripper lived to a ripe old age, and there might be a few people that might know where he may have gone, but I don't think anyone's going to say anything. However, I do think some of the suspects, list of suspects, are always kind of funny. I always found the Lewis Carroll suspect very ridiculous. But other than that, I always found Jack the Ripper fascinating. And I know that H.H. Holmes over in America actually always read the stories about Jack the Ripper, and he actually took that into kind. So when he started doing his serial killings, he didn't mimic them, but he kind of took that into consideration. So that's kind of an interesting thought, that Jack the Ripper may have inspired other serial killers.
Yeah.
So somebody put a comment in earlier about I think it was maybe Kirsty Murphy, was it? I think maybe
about the Yorkshire.
He was caught in Sheffield, but somebody else put a comment in about the Yorkshire Ripper.
I'll see if I can find it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the letters, Scott, to the Dear Boss letter and the letter from hell to George Lusk were probably made by a journalist just trying to whip up some more attention, really. It's quite possible.
Red herrings, basically.
There's a comment there. It was Andy that made it. It sure is. Living in Yorkshire, we hear about the Yorkshire Ripper a lot, but this is the person who started it all.
Right. Yeah.
Are you there? Because I've seen Kirsty Murphy and Andy Murphy. Wayne Miles has seen he's going to live ghost in London on Facebook this year. One will be of Jack the Ripper and around Whitechapel and Highgate. But we're hoping to get into London later on this year, Wayne. I was talking to you last week. We're hoping to head to London as well to get Highgate and Whitechapel. I think, even though it's changed a lot, it would still be a fascinating place to wander, to do an investigation in. Because if you think of the amount of poverty, suffering, misery that was on there, it's just, there's got to be something still, some kind of energy still there. There's Andy making a comment. Have the files which listed as being top secret, which were supposed to be made public, but have the files which are listed as being top secret, which were supposed to be made public, but had their date put back, actually been released. I've no idea, Andy. What do you think of that one, Simon?
Again, this royal conspiracy does keep coming up, really. If they have been put back, then they've been put back for a reason. And that reason, well, it's worth looking into, isn't it, really?
You see, the royal conspiracy, obviously, is another theory, again, is that he did have some medical training, possibly, medical school. And obviously back then, you had to have money. So it's obviously that he came from a well-to-do family, maybe.
That would point at John Druitt, really. He was certainly the Met and Scotland Yard's chief suspect, because he disappeared the same night, the 7th of November. He disappeared that same night, and probably horrified what he'd done. Probably jumped to the River Thames, but it's just again sheer speculation, really.
Yeah, and it's just, if he was a medical student, was it maybe a way of him carrying on his studies in his own warped mind?
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then the Mary Kelly, that was like beyond anything. I mean, I saw some of those pictures. I'm baffled by the atrocity of those alone.
They were beyond brutal. I mean, and it's funny how people get the Ripper now. He's Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire. I think it ought to stem back to, the original Jack the Ripper. It is a fascinating case. It's something that we'll never know the answer to. And people throughout the ages have had many different theories, and no doubt in the future many different theories will still pop up. One thing we are totally sure about is he's dead now anyway. I think that's...
Jennifer, you did mention the Zodiac Killer. Now, he was a pretty horrible character, wasn't he? And again, he was never, ever caught. But I believe the FBI were nearly convinced of who he was, but couldn't prove it. Isn't that true?
That is very true. They actually narrowed it down to 2 suspects, and one of them they didn't want to address because he was prior police, and that's like bad. I guess you say bad juju. You don't want to accuse your own kind.
Right.
So the case is considered still open. They haven't. It's not completely closed yet.
A very, very evil person.
Very evil. Yeah. It's
and someone who got delight in killing as well, didn't he? Really.
But isn't it interesting where Jack the Ripper, whether or not it was a journalist who wrote those letters, the Jack the Ripper letters, the same thing with the Zodiac. There are some. I'm not saying that the way they killed people were similar, but they had similarities in their timeline. One was a little bit spread up versus one spread out, but there's so many similarities between the two. It's creepy.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
James asking, when it comes up, do you think Jack the Ripper murdered many more and dumped them in the Thames? And I think he could have been a doctor.
Well, thanks for that question, Wayne. Certainly some experience of removing organs. But there again, Aaron Kosminski, he'd work in the Spitalfields cattle markets. He would slaughter cows all day long, pigs, etc., and he'd have to remove these organs. So again, he would have had knowledge of that. But we do know in the case of the murder of Jack the Ripper, he wanted his bodies to be found. And as Scott mentioned before, these murders did continue, but there were slight different discrepancies in the way they're being killed. And the forensic teams realised that they could have been committed by a different murderer. But the 5, the Nichols, the Chapman, the Lizzie Dean, the Catherine Eddowes and the Mary Kelly murders were all pretty similar, and they all lost their lives with the same knife. We do know that. Scotland Yard have a museum called the Black Museum, and they say the knife is in there, but again, it's sheer speculation, really. Some sort of cover-up could have taken place, but many people believe that when Aaron Kosminski was taken to this place in Brighton, the seaside house, Lavender, Levi and Harris wouldn't testify against him because a Jew is not allowed to do that, apparently. And they believe that Kosminski may or may not have been Jack the Ripper. We'll never know, but he was certainly foreign and was about the same height seen by Israel Schwartz, Elizabeth Long, and Lavender, of course.
Kirsty Murphy's asking, there was a phone call from hell. Do you think he was close to the thrush? Probably not, as he wasn't caught.
Truth.
Sorry, that's his thrush.
I know, but I think she meant truth.
Sorry, Kirsty. Sorry. My bad. Close to the truth, probably not, as he wasn't caught. But I think that was a film with Johnny. Was that Johnny Depp that was in that film?
Correct.
That many films about Jack the Ripper.
He played the lead. He played the inspector, the one that was leading the Jack the Ripper case. That's who he was playing.
Like Whitechapel, the series, that was quite good.
Well, I've no idea, Kirsty. Absolutely not. We watched a few Ripper films, and you just don't know. I do think that he got some kind of gratification out of it. Now, the thing that makes me think that the most is the night of the double murder, because he was disturbed, and I think that would have put him into a rage because he hadn't got his jollies, for want of a better word, and and so that's how he was so quick to go and get somebody else, because he had to fulfil that need, whatever it was. So I think that's why we had the double murder that night, because he was simply disturbed, and that kind of peed him off.
Yeah.
So he thought somebody else is getting it. Know what I mean? But he did get gratification. I think he did, Robbie. He got some kind of jollies out of the killing, but as I say, at the end of the day, absolutely horrendous. And it's something that will never ever be solved. And the way you tell it, Simon, is absolutely amazing. You get everybody sitting totally.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you once again for kindly asking me onto the show again. And it's nice to see Jennifer as well, of course. And it's great to have a transatlantic slot. Lovely, yeah.
It's weird, the USA team's been running since the 4th of January. Mm-hmm. So it's still early days, but we're getting there. We get Jennifer, we get Matthew as well. He's got other commitments tonight. That's how he's not here. So, and I hope to build during the year as well. Get more members. But that's up to Jennifer and Matthew.
Of course, yeah. I must say, Jennifer, I cover a tour of a beautiful 1322 hall called Samlesbury Hall. It's a Tudor building. It's a gorgeous building. But there is actually a very, very strong connection with the American War of Independence. And a most amazing guy called John Creasap. And John was a British Army officer. And he married a very wealthy young lady called Jean Braddock. And being an officer, he was sent overseas to the garrison at Philadelphia, and then from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh up to Boston. And his wife loved New England, and she said, "John, why don't you resign a commission and become a civilian? This land is marvellous." Well, he left the army and formed his own business and was doing very well. His next-door neighbours were doing very well. And this was the land of opportunity for these British settlers. However, one guy knew more about this than anyone else, and that was old King George back in England. And he thought, these people need to be taxed and taxed again. And John said to his wife one day, "I'm working my socks off, and all I'm doing is paying tax back to England." He then met a gentleman called George Washington, and George Washington recognised John's Northern English accent because his parents came from Lancashire. And he said, "John, I believe you've served in the British Army. I'd like to know all about British Army infantry tactics, because I'd like to throw the British out of North America. Will you join me? I will join you. I'm sick and tired of this taxation. It's got beyond a joke. So John Creasap became what's called a Pathfinder General in Washington's rebel forces. He was at Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Ticonderoga, and the final surrender at Yorktown in 1781. Now the Brits had gone, of course, America became an independent country. And Washington asked for John Creasap to see him. John, I'd like to offer you a position in the new United States Armed Forces as a general. Will you take up this position? I will, sir. My mission for you is to encourage the natives to leave certain areas. And I think it's fair to say that John Creasap had blood on his hands, the murder of many an innocent squaw and many an innocent brave. But all good things come to an end when he was captured by the Huron, North American Canadian Indians. And just like John Wayne in the famous Western movie, tied to the totem pole, all his men were dispatched. And he was ordered to be given the death of 1,000 cuts, a very painful, painful death. But John Creasap was a Yorkshireman, and Yorkshire folk can be very, very stubborn. In fact, Sir Ranulph Fiennes, that great British explorer, will take no one from Yorkshire on any of his tours because they like to whinge and complain. And this guy was no different. Tied to the totem pole, he was heard to say the words, "You'll get nout from me." The Indians couldn't believe this. They'd never seen such bravery, and they became frightened of him. He wasn't frightened to be burnt to death. They released his bonds. He disappeared into the forest, got back to Washington's headquarters and said, "Sir, I've really had enough of this, sir. I'd like to return to my native Craven in West Yorkshire." And George Washington said there and then, "John, my country is indebted to you. You will always be an American citizen." Well, he got back to his native Craven, which is West Yorkshire. He died at the age of 74. And every 4th of July, a member of the American Embassy in London will make his or her way up to this place called Elsack near Bradford to make sure the grave has been polished and some fresh flowers placed on the grave. And the grave is now the property of the Pentagon. And it proudly says General John Creasap, United States Armed Forces. And this very, very day, he's still on the salary of the Pentagon. But quite a beautiful story, that one, really. And I've been to...
Yeah, I didn't know about the other half.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the American War of Independence, it was really, in many ways, a British Civil War, wasn't it, really? In many, many ways, where Britain fought Britain, really. But the outcome, of course, totally different.
Indeed.
It's amazing how things tie in. I'm going to wind, just before we wind it up there,
Sure.
Nicole's wanting you to come back again, Simon. You're always a hit, so you know. And just Robbie's saying he'd love to do paranormal investigation, many American battlefields, buildings, hospitals, and prisons. Well, one of our plans for an American team, Robbie, is for them to go out, you know, restrictions permitting, obviously.
Yes.
Do an investigation. We'll do it as a live. You know, we obviously will be here, and the American team will be out in the field.
Fantastic. Yeah.
In the pipeline. Obviously, they'll choose the location.
That is marvellous. Marvellous.
That's hopefully coming up. But we'll wind it up there for tonight, folks. We're back next week. We've got South Coast Paranormal coming in. We have Paul from Paranormal Analysis. And we've got Maria and Jeff, 2 of the stars from the movie The Crumbs, part of CRA Entertainment there, and next week to see us as well. But the poster will get up on Facebook anyway to let you know times and dates and stuff. So that's coming up next week. But so if we could just hold on to you, Simon, for a wee minute or two.
Of course, sure.
So thanks very much, everybody, for coming in, and enjoy what's left of your weekend, and stay safe, and we'll talk to you all very soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, folks.
Toodles.